Winter Derby. Dave Firth Bard outdid his own records repeatedly with the largest webcam old school event ever here. There's 378 players playing Swedish, and yeah, it was or is pretty crazy because it's still going on right now. The playoffs are about to start. I'm going to go over the deck I played, Vaultatog, here, and then I'm going to try to post match at least every day in the next few days, and maybe the event will be over by the time I finish this um, playlist. So let's go to the deck. This out of the way. Here we go. So I'm playing what I call Vaultatog. A lot of the Atog based decks often have the other thing that they're doing as part of their name, like Dibbatog is Serendib plus Atog, Liontog is usually Savannah Lions plus Atog. So here I'm playing Time Vault with Atog, so I'm calling it Vaultatog. And yeah, Time Vault, the typical beatdown second half to go along with Atog, like those other ones. Just as aggressive as Serendib or Lions, probably. The thing about Swedish is there's no Fallen Empires, one Strip Mine, and one Workshop as the relevant differences from many other formats. And here, we'll just start off with the lands. You see, I'm playing the 4 factories for sure. I'm playing 3 City of Brass, the 1 Strip Mine, and I'm playing 1 Workshop. Because it's allowed to be 1 Workshop. Even if there were 4 available, I don't think you'd want to play 4 in a deck like this. But we'll get to that. I'm playing all the power, so we can skip by all the power, Soul Ring, stuff like that. Splashing for Tutor, Mind Twist, Balance, just good restricted cards. The only notable one that's missing of the often splashed restricted cards are Regrowth. So there's no Regrowth. The typical core of Atog, Black Fies, and Lightning Bolt is always in all the Atog decks. Usually they also play Chain Lightning, but I needed space for cards we'll talk about later. My Atogs are a 2 Antiquities 2 revised split, which is pretty unfortunate. I don't have 2 more Antiquities ones and I want to get them, but it's the type of thing where they're like $1 or whatever. So it's the type of card I will add to my TCG orders from specific sellers occasionally to try to get up to free shipping. So you kind of need those cheap cards to fill in every once in a while because I'm a slave to that free shipping value and have to go get those. So continuing on from left to right, after skipping around for a little bit there, we have the Shatters under the Atog. Kind of just a good all-around answer, especially for Factory. That's probably the biggest thing that I needed in against. I just wanted more ways to instantly punish a Factory outside of the Lightning Bolts. But obviously, there's plenty of artifacts in old school for you to hit. So we have a pair of Shatters there. We have the Chaos Orb, which is hard to imagine any decks that don't want a Chaos Orb. I'm sure it probably happens, but not that often. Then we have a Winter Orb, which I'm going to talk about with Winter Orb, Relic Barrier, and Hallowing Mine. So that's a typical prison package. However, I'm only playing 1 Winter Orb and 3 Howling Mines. Relic Barrier, I think, is pretty similar space as Shatter, as its primary use is to deal with factories, but there's other artifacts that matter, tapping down Moxen during upkeeps at the start of their turn, try to trap them under Vice a little bit more that way. Stuff like that is still pretty relevant. Here, I'm adding Howling Mine and Winter Orb as proactive targets in my own deck to tap down. Relic Barrier plus Howling Mine is actually my favorite combo in old school. Drawing an extra turn or an extra card each turn seems pretty sweet. It's like a bad 2-card build your own library, but you don't have to be at 7 cards, which is something that I rarely do anyway. I like to be playing out my cards, so it's hard to get an active library sometimes. But with this, you get to feel kind of cheaty in tapping your own Howling Mine for their turn, so they don't draw the card and drawing the extra card yourself. It does have a lot of downside of getting them to draw an extra card when you don't have the Relic Barrier, and then they just blow up the Howling Mine. That happens an unfortunate number of times because I play this combo a lot, and sometimes you just kind of have to run it out there. But while it's active, nothing feels better to me than having those two cards. Once I have the 4 Relic Barriers though, I was like, oh, I'm going to try out Miser's Winter Orb here. Pretty great against the deck or other slower controlling things that use up a lot of mana. You gotta gum them up for a while. Vaultatog is also an out that sometimes you can kind of play even without Relic Barrier, lock them down for a turn, and then eat the Winter Orb with your Vaultatog and untap naturally for yourself if you don't have the Relic Barrier to tap it down. So it has some nice synergies anyway outside of your typical Relic Barrier. It's another artifact to cast off of Workshop, which made it more okay for me to play that single Workshop. All that being said, I don't think if I played this deck again, I would have the 1 Winter Orb. It's a little cute. It did do stuff, but I don't think it justifies a deck slot here. 3 Howling Mines instead of 4 was a near last minute cut. I basically would much rather draw extra Relic Barriers because Relic Barriers are just good in the deck, even without a single Howling Mine. While Howling Mines are a lot more risky to be playing when you don't have the Relic Barrier. So because I didn't want to overload on more mines than Relic Barriers, decided that I had to play fewer mines than Relic Barriers, and that's how I ended up with the 4-3 split. The deck is really tight on space anyway, so a lot of my early goldfishing, I don't really test decks by playing other people, I just goldfish myself while watching TV. I had way more than 60 cards, and I just added a couple extra of the lands. And yeah, just too many times I drew extra Howling Mines. Getting that first one is great, and getting additional ones is only good if you have those extra Relic Barriers. Going on to the next column, the card that helps name the deck, Time Vault. So early on I was playing 3, 4 Time Vaults instead of just 2. I was also packing some Twiddles, but in the end, to get down to 60 cards, ended up cutting some of the Time Vaults and then all of the Twiddles. Taking extra turns, looking a little bit more Twiddle Vaulty is neat, but Twiddle was the worst card in the deck. It was basically a situational time walk. Sometimes it acted like a bad Shatter or single-use Relic Barrier. You couldn't cast it off Workshop, and though at its powerful times it was super powerful because being a bad time walk is an awesome card, there's too many times where it just didn't line up correctly and it was just a bad card in my hand. And I wanted the deck to be a little bit more consistent because this deck is already much less consistent than your typical Vaultatog decks. So there's a couple of neat things you can do with Time Vault though, and I think it's a little underplayed overall in old school, and I think people should be playing maybe 1 copy or 2 copies, depending, in just honest decks and playing Time Vault honestly with no twiddle. So let's talk about some of the things that Time Vault is able to do in a deck and shell like this. The most straightforward plan is you play like a turn 2 turn 2 Time Vault, and you just skip an early turn. So you lose out on that early turn where both players don't have many resources, might only have 2 lands out or land in a mox or something like that. So you're skipping a pretty small turn, and then you just leave the Time Vault untapped until a later turn where you might have 6 mana, more cards, or you're planning to cast a draw 7, but you only have 3 or 4 mana, but you want to take the first big turn after the draw 7, stuff like that. You just skip that early small turn and take a big turn later. The nice part about doing that also is you don't have to really be scared of things like disenchant. Once you skip the turn, even if they go to disenchant, you just pick the turn back then. And every later turn is typically going to be better than those early turns that were skipped. So that's just the most straightforward way to play the card. Every single deck can play it in that fashion, and it's pretty okay-ish. So it needs to be doing more than that to be like, okay, this is a real card. So the other things that it can do, level 2 is, well, I'm playing Howling Mine. So I can skip a turn where I draw one card, and then later on, or the turn after or whatever, I play a Howling Mine and take an extra turn. Well, now it's already replacing itself because I'm skipping a one draw turn for a two or more draw turn. Well, that's obvious to understand why that's good, because I'm just drawing more cards on the extra turn than I am on the skipped turn. So that's a nice little combo with that card, and that's the typical thing Twiddle Vault's doing anyway, so it's not like novel, but that's the typical Time Vault usage, is to draw extra cards through Howling Mine. The other thing it does is, obviously it's an artifact attack with Vaultatog, but it can give Vaultatog pseudo haste. So even if you don't have an Vaultatog in play, once you have a concentration of artifacts and an untapped Time Vault, your opponent kind of has to play like you could play an Vaultatog out of nowhere and kill them at any time. This really constrains their options as they end up possibly, if they only have, let's say, one factory or one creature, like they have an Urnum or something, they have to consider not attacking anymore on your blank board because they need the blocker, because Vaultatog played on my first turn, take an extra turn, hit is actually just lethal. So you can force them to play extra defense in that fashion, and you can also get some good information about their hand in those situations too. Let's say they realize that this is a way that they can be killed. So they, again in the Urnum scenario, they stop attacking with their one Urnum Djinn. And then 2 turns later, they're like, you know what, I'm going to start attacking with my Djinn. Why does that occur? Probably because they just drew a Swords to Plowshares or something like that. So then you understand, oh, what they have as an answer and stuff like that, things you have to get out of your hand. You now know how many artifacts to sack to your Vaultatog, enough to make them use the sword, but not enough, but not fully commit. Maybe they end up taking the hit and get into burn range. Stuff like that all becomes pretty relevant, and an untapped Time Vault helps get you that information and gets you the extra turns where they don't attack you with their only creature, whether or not you have an Vaultatog, because there's the fear there. Next card, or next thing that Time Vault does is its interaction with how it works with the end of the turn. So a lot of people are less clear about this. It's a very rulesy thing, but here you will learn about how to leverage Time Vault in later turns, especially against decks like the deck. So I'm going to put out a few example scenarios here. I'll have a tapped Time Vault in play. My opponent is on the deck. It's a late turn. Let's say they have 6 mana, including a Library of Alexandria, and they have 7 cards in hand, and they have a Jayemdae Tome on the board. So they're just dominating the board situation, and this is like a terrible spot to be in against the deck. And they will go, okay, pass the turn with my 6 mana up, ready to draw 2 more cards, full hand, does everything. They can keep up their whatever answers they might have, whether it's counter spells and swords or disenchants, all this stuff. And I will say, okay, I'll skip my turn and untap my vault. And they'll say, oh, hold on. In response, I'm going to Library and Tome, go up to 9. And I have to stop them. They're like, no, that's not how Time Vault works. You cannot respond with more stuff because you choose Time Vault as a replacement for your turn. So this is after my opponent's discard. Their turn is over. We're now in the time to replace my turn. There's no time for instance. You can't draw with your library. You cannot use your tome. You can't use any of your 6 mana. You just wasted your turn. You skipped your turn too. It is now your next turn already. None of those things get to tap. and we're already past your untap phase. So you can't tap them in response there. They lose their library draw, they lose their tome draw, they lose everything there. And now it's like we both skipped a turn. They got one extra draw for their draw step, but I'll let them draw one extra card to untap my Time Vault. When they lost their library draw and their Jam Day Tome draw there, it just seems great. So now let's fast forward to another scenario. Now, or the same scenario again, and they realize this is how it works. What do they do here? They know if they pass, that's terrible because they just lose all their draws and mana. So they have to sheepishly say something like, okay, tap and draw with library now, going up to 8 cards. And they have to decide, well, what do I have to cast or do now? Otherwise, I'm just going to discard this card and be down this. They also don't want to lose out on their tome. Maybe they decide to tap the tome and draw another card. Now they're up to 9 cards, but they only have 1 mana left because they had 6 mana. One of them was library, down to 5 mana. Use the tome, now they're down to 2 mana. Now they have to discard down to 7 from 9, discarding 2 cards. And I say, I don't skip my turn. Their defenses are down. Why would I skip a turn? Now I can get past counterspells, I can get past disenchants and stuff like that because they only have 1 mana left. So now it forces them to tap down and lose all their fast answers. If counterspell is completely dead, things like disenchant they can obviously play on their next turn, but that's going to use up their mana for the next turn instead of this turn. And if they're going to want to keep an active library, they're going to have to do that again during their turn. It just puts them in this really awkward scenario. So, or let's say they only use the library and decide to keep 5 mana up, not using the Jam Day Tome. Now I have options depending on my hand whether or not I want to skip the turn. I get to see what they discard because they have to choose that before I choose to skip the turn. And then they have to decide, oh, and I get to decide now, do I want to make them waste 5 mana in the tome? They drew an extra card off the library, so they got to sculpt their hand a bit, but they're not up an extra card. Still good, but maybe now it's worth it for me to skip a turn. Maybe it's not. It depends. Puts them in that goofy spot. So you can do those goofy type things. If you ever get 2 Time Vaults in play, it gets really nasty along those lines. Let's say I have 1 tapped one and 1 untapped one. Now, in that same scenario, what are they supposed to do? Well, if they tap everything down, I can take 2 turns, play the Vaultatog, attack, factories, all this stuff. 2 turns with their defenses down. They can't do that. They can't use them anymore. And if they decide, okay, I can't use everything, I have to keep everything up because I need all my resources against 2 potential turns in a row, then I just skip a turn. They lose everything again, and now I have 3 turns in a row. They certainly have to keep their defenses up, and it's just this awful scenario for them to be in once you have 2 active Time Vaults. It actually gives any player trying to play a reactive game fits, because it forces them to use the mana proactively when all their cards are reactive, forces them to draw cards and use their Jam Day Tome and stuff like that on their main phase in hopes that they get to play something. So Time Vault actually does a whole lot of things with weird lines. People aren't really as sure how to play it. Maybe there will come a day where everyone understands, okay, this is how you play against it and whatnot, but it's still kind of early now, and I just kind of think it's something that you can splash 1 or 2 of in a lot of decks to utilize these upsides without even doing the standard twiddling of your vault and whatnot. So Time Vault, it's awesome. I would play this in Vaultatog again, and the card is super powerful. The next card down is City in a Bottle. So City in a Bottle is kind of a weird one because it destroys my own library and City of Brass. And that's partly why I only played 4 City of Brass. But City in a Bottle is super powerful in that Serendib is, I think, the best creature, or at least pervasive in the format. It's everywhere, it's powerful, and City in a Bottle full on blanks them. It's also nice to trap City of Brass in people's hands when you're playing a Vice type deck. I can play it off of workshop, and then I can eat it with Atog if I have to get City of Brass down later to like cast one of my splash cards or something like that. So just hit for an extra 2 after destroying maybe a Div and a City of Brass of my opponents. So it can do all sorts of these type of control-y things. And if your opponent sees City of in a Bottle in your main, they're certainly not bringing in City of in a Bottle against you, which clears way for my own Saren Dibs, which I have in the sideboard. I can side out the bottles in the Dibs, go to town, while being relatively confident that my opponent won't be bottling me back. This basically changes depending on how your game 1 goes, whether they see it or not, whether or not it matters to them, and it becomes a guessing game for them, but it's pretty nice in that manner. I think City in a Bottle is generally underplayed also. It doesn't go in every deck, obviously, because some decks are using their Arabian cards, but if you are not, you should be packing City in a Bottle main. It is a better main deck card than sideboard card because from the side a lot of people will be ready for it. They might be siding out some of their Arabian cards or things like that. But in the main, it's devastating to a lot of people, and then hopefully it matters to them. And it's especially good in Atog when it's not a dead card, even in those times where your opponent is not on Arabian stuff. Then we have the already mentioned restricted cards, Time Walk, Balance over here, Mind Twist right next to them. The draw 7s at the top right are the most powerful cards in the deck. Then we have 2 Suchi. Suchi in Swedish does not deal mana burn. There's no mana burn in Swedish. I have the workshop. I added these in because I felt like I needed a few more threats. Just the 4 Atogs wasn't quite enough, and I needed something that hit hard. And Suchi was my go-to one. Also off of Workshop and like a Mox, you can play turn 1 Suchi, which is obviously a great play coming out of the gate that quickly. When you've taken extra turns, the hasty Suchi dealing 4 is super relevant in a deck with Vice and Bolts and factories and stuff like that. Every little bit of chip damage puts them in a more and more precarious situation. So Suchi is pretty good as a 2-of here. They did get sided out quite often. The other things that would often get sided out were the Howling Mines got sided out all the time. The Wardorb got sided out all the time. City in the Bottle got sided out all the time when it's not the right targets. A lot of times I side out a bunch of these artifact type things because I foresee my opponent bringing in Energy Flux or Dust to Dust and more of the artifact destruction. So if you notice my sideboard at the bottom there, it's almost all colored cards instead of artifacts because I want to divest myself in artifacts. I side out the workshop all the time. Also when I side out the artifacts, and I side in things that can do stuff if my opponent energy fluxes. That's basically the big fear is energy flux. When I side out that workshop, you might be thinking, oh, if there's not setting out a land's kind of dangerous. Well, it doesn't cast everything. And even if you count my lands now, I'm skimping on land even compared to normal Atog. And the reason I feel confident doing that is because I have Howling Mine. I'm drawing more cards than the typical Atog deck, so I feel like I can lose a land and not feel quite as bad. I don't have to overload as much. If I draw an extra card here and there, that should make up for the difference. I'm also playing a bit lower curve than typical, let's say, Dibbatog, which is probably the most popular Atog variant, because Saren Dibs cost 3. A lot of what I replaced it with are like 2-drop Howling Mine or whatever, and I have Workshop to cast those. So my curve is a little lower, my mana is a little bit more explosive, I draw a few more cards, so I cut a land. So that's also how I got to fit in a few more other cards. So let's go through the sideboard. First card there is Earthquake. Should be self-explanatory. Sometimes you're just playing White Weenie or green, mono green Stompy, which is something DFB has cemented into the metagame as of late. Just got to clear up a bunch of small guys sometimes. Then I have the 4 Chain Lightnings. Those came in all the time when I was siding out the artifact package. Those are typically played in ATOG anyway, just to get more burn, and the concentration makes your draw 7 so much better when you're just lightning bolting and chain lightning people out when they're in single digit life points, getting them super low. We have the red and blue blasts. Red blast hits all power, but is mostly in there for energy flux. That's what I'm scared of. The blue blast, I ended up playing one in case there was Blood Moon or uh, other ATOG decks to hit their ATOGs, but um, in hindsight, I don't think I'm all that scared of Blood Moon. If you look at my main deck, yeah, there's the splash cards, there's the blue power, but that's it. We have 3 blue power, we have Mind Twist Demonic Tutor, we have Balance. Everything else is artifact or red. So, Blood Moon? Okay, I guess you traded 1 card for a few of my very powerful cards. Hopefully I don't draw them, or I played them earlier, or yeah, you got me with the Blood Moon. That's fine. So just 1 blue blast probably enough. I have 1 Hercules Recall against more artifact-based decks, and it's just great with Black Vice. If you have a Vice and you Hercules a bunch of artifacts back to their hand in their upkeep in response to the Vice trigger, it can deal out a lot of damage. The Serendibs we talked about before, those come in when I need more threats, and I think I'm dodging City in a Bottle. Again, when a bunch of artifacts come out, these guys will sometimes come in. The thing you never want to bring them in against are decks with Sarah Angel. That is just a sad time, so don't do that. Also against decks like the deck Anka Mishra. Anka Mishra and Copper Tablet are typical ATOG main deck cards, actually, against things like the deck. And Ankh is awesome against it. It's a great way for you to beat them because they're just trying to play a slow game, build up their mana base, play those lands, and these things end up doing a ton of damage. But something had to go in the decks, so to make space for the newer cards that I wanted to try out. So I only have 1 Ankh here. That way I can kind of tutor for it if that's what it calls for. It's kind of a pipe dream. Even though kind of like the Winter Orb, it's like, oh yeah, it's kind of like I have 2 because I have Tutor. That's not true. Tutor half the time grabs like Ancestral. The other times it will grab things like a Draw 7 or a Balance. Every once in a while maybe you grab a Mind Twist, but really Tutor is grabbing your powerful restricted cards. It's not grabbing value. This is a good card against other people. So you can't count random one-offs like Winter Orb as a tutor target. It's, yeah, you can probably make a convoluted solution or a scenario where Winter Orb is what you want to be grabbing, but in reality, no, you're gonna get Ancestral or something else. Mana Barbs is the last card there, which I think is another pet card that I love playing. I think it's also underrated and underplayed. It deals a lot of damage to, once again, the same type of decks that Ankh is good against. No one's drawing with JM Tome with Mana Barbs out unless they're using mostly artifact mana. Really constrains what it is that they can do. Everything hurts. If you get out to even like a Vice start, they have to cast their cards. And Mana Barbs puts them in a rock and a hard place type scenario. So that's this deck. This video is way longer than I thought. I didn't realize I was going to talk so much about these things. Yep, I'm just going to cut it off awkwardly right now.